Hi, welcome to the design project. So today we have Oliver Binz from INSEAD, who's going to present his paper on investment inflation and the role of internal information quality as a transmission channel. And some housekeeping rules. One, it would be great if everyone could turn on their video so we can see your faces. And then two, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand using the reaction function, or you can type it in the chat box and I will follow up. All right, Oliver, time is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the nice introduction, Holly, and Stephen and Ayung. Thank you guys for setting up this beautiful series. I think now for already the third year, right? Or is it the second year? Great to be on it again. So this is a paper with Peter, who's also here at INSEAD, and Aliyah, who's at Duke. And in this paper, we examine a topic that is on many people's mind these days, the effects of inflation on firms, right? And in particular, we single in on the role of internal information systems as a transmission channel. Right? So let's motivate it a bit, I guess. When we started that paper a year ago, I had a harder time motivating it. Now it's pretty easy, so I could delete a lot of slides. So this is something that is now already a month old. We just got the new news that inflation went even higher. So now we are at 7.9%, but we were already at a 40-year high a month ago. So it doesn't slow down very much. So inflation is really at an all-time high now, and it becomes a big topic. It's also not that this is just isolated things as people originally suspected a couple of months ago. This is something that is pretty pervasive throughout the economy. So we see that food prices are rising, right? We see that energy prices are rising. We see that house prices and rents are rising. We see that car prices are rising. We see that raw material prices are rising, and many other indices, right? So we're really living right now, again, in an era of inflation, where we have inflation being present for the prices for many goods throughout the economy. So why do we care about this? So why would we think about inflation? And I guess from the perspective of financial economists, well, why do we care about it? Well, one of the age-old questions in finance and accounting research was, well, how does inflation really affect corporate investment, right? Arguably one of the most important decisions that firms make in their life cycle. And there are a couple of different perspectives on it. And I want to highlight two here to kind of give you a sense of what's out there. Well, the initial models, basically that are still the groundwork of the models that we see today, are the real business cycle models. So they don't have any frictions whatsoever. Everything is efficient, right? In that case, it's pretty clear what will happen when inflation goes up. Nothing. Right, so prices will adjust perfectly, and as a result, well, prices are just a numerator, everything doubles, but okay, then we just have twice as many dollars as before, but that doesn't really affect our real decisions. So in the case of non-frictions whatsoever, nominal variables such as inflation, they do not affect real decisions in the long run. However, then we have alternative models which introduce frictions basically to these real business cycle models. And we focus on one particular type of model here, and that is imperfect information models, where you basically have information frictions, right? So that you have different agents in the economy that observe the effects of different variables only with noise. So in imperfect information models, for example, as I will elaborate a little bit more on the next slide when I talk about our hypothesis development, there we have these information frictions that prevent firms from filtering nominal, aggregate, and real firm level shocks, right? They basically observe these two types of shocks with noise, and they are not able to perfectly disentangle between them. And that leads us to two conclusions, which are basically the two hypotheses that we test in this paper. The first is that nominal variables do affect real decisions, particularly in the short run. And second, that internal information systems that might have something to do with the quality of the signals that firms receive. Well, if we have internal information systems that are of higher quality, then, well, they can then act in mitigating the effects of normal aggregate variables or inflation on real investment decisions. And let me illustrate that just graphically. So here we have the firm in the middle, and the firm has an internal information system that helps it to take information in and then use that information to make decisions, right? So for example, the firm is constantly targeted or constantly hit by firm level shocks, which are noisy, right? So we generally do not observe like the true underlying substance of all the signals. We see certain statistics for demand for our products or other things, but there's generally noise in there, right? So we don't observe those perfectly. But the internal information system of the firm, then it helps us really to make sense of these signals that we get, right? So it helps us to really filter that information and then use that information to hopefully make better decisions. And arguably, again, oh, please, Holly.
Oliver, yeah, so Ayang has a question.
Ayang, please.
Do you want to finish your current slide? Because my question relates to the previous one. Yeah. Do you want to?
Oh, we can go back and I can kind of build on it. I mean, I'll take a bit longer on this one. So let me go here.
So I think when I read the intro, like you spent probably like 1.5 pages talking about this macro literature. And it's probably like I have very limited knowledge about that literature. So I understand that the first part, the nominal variable, should not affect the real decisions, right? The missing part is that I don't know why the nominal variables actually do affect real decisions. And more specifically, why do you think there should be a positive effect on the investment?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think inflation would increase or causes increase in individual corporate investments? That part is I don't really see any explanations either from the literature or from you to rationalize that outcome. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, we need to really make sure to make that a bit clearer in the paper. So basically, the grand idea is that not sure whether it's a grand idea, but the idea is that you have these signals, right? On the one side, the real signals, which clearly should have an impact on the firm's decision making, right? On the other hand, you have these nominal signals, but when you basically only observe like the aggregate of the signals, then you cannot perfectly disentangle between the real and the nominal signals. Actually, let me go here. Hopefully, this slide will actually make that a bit clearer. So on the one hand, we have the real signals that arguably should matter, right? So if I see that the real demand for my product is changing, or that competitors are kind of entering my industry or something like that, that should have an impact on my investment decision making. On the other hand, then you have firms. Firms are also hit by these nominal signals, right? In particular, aggregate movements in certain price levels. And often these kind of come together, right? So when you, for example, think about the demand for your products, you don't necessarily know whether now more people are buying your product because a competitor went broke, or because consumers just like your product very much, or because maybe there was like some nominal shock somewhere that led to a difference in the relative price of your product relative to others. So these typically firms see these different types of shocks commingled in one signal, right? And the idea behind the Lucas model, so basically these imperfect information models, is that when firms cannot perfectly disentangle between these real and these nominal shocks, then you might have effects that, then you might have a situation that when the firm cannot perfectly disentangle them, they might actually react to a nominal shock because they cannot be perfectly sure that it doesn't involve like a real shock. Or when you have these commingled shocks, you might not be perfectly able to say how much of the shock was worth to like a nominal signal, how much of it is due to a real signal. And as a result, because you only see the pooled thing, you might end up reacting to these nominal shocks. That's kind of the friction that Lucas forwarded in 1972, which is really the basis of these imperfect information models that we see today. Does it make it a bit more clear?
Yeah, I think it's kind of consistent with a lot of kind of disclosure. So think about Verrocchio in 1993, right? When the managers internally will have a superior private signal compared to outsiders. There's just a different weighting system, how to disentangle and try to identify the underlying fundamentals or truth, right? I think I will let you talk more about, but I'm still kind of struggle to understand why there's a positive relationship between inflation and investment. That doesn't seem that the disentangle different signals will lead to a positive rather than negative or other directional association between inflation and corporate investment. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. Like first, to your first point, I think like this idea of joint signals is probably pretty intuitive to us accountants, right? Because we have like our theory models typically built on basically the same mechanisms. When you think about Kanodia and Sapra 2016 or others, like all these real effect papers, that we typically have a situation that, you know, there are multiple signals and then you have like a signal extraction problem. This is the same thing. Why does it lead to a positive one? Well, you know, basically if you see the aggregate of the two, the aggregate of the price and the quantity component, so speaking, then, well, if the price is higher and you cannot perfectly say that this is because of the price and not because of the quantity, then that might actually make you react, right? If the price is lower, then you would actually see like a worse aggregate signal, right? So the two generally move in tandem with each other, so speaking. And as a result of that, when you see like an increase in the quantity that you observe in the aggregate signal, whether it's either from nominal shocks or from real shocks, then if you cannot perfectly disentangle them, you're generally incentivized to react positively to that. That is kind of a bit the idea. So we have really these internal information systems that function here as a transmission channel for aggregate nominal shocks into real firm level decisions. For example, investment, arguably again, like the core decisions that firms are making. And what is the mechanism? Well, it's that these internal information systems might actually help us to observe the real firm level shocks with less noise, right? So this is kind of what the core thing that we have in mind. When you have like these two different types of shocks, the aggregate shocks and the firm level shocks, we would intuitively think that that what these internal information systems probably do pretty well is that they help us to improve, so speaking, the precision with which we observe these real level shocks, right? So these firm level shocks typically have two types of volatility to them. The one is real volatility, so that the actual underlying constructs change. And the other one is just measurement error with which firms are observing the signals, right? So if internal information models can help us to alleviate that measurement error to some extent, then they have the potential to really help firms to filter these two types of shocks better from each other. That is kind of the idea of our hypothesis development here.
So Oliver, there are two other people who have their hands up. So first is Stephen and then next is Gary.
Yeah, I guess I'm having trouble sort of differentiating between these real shocks and these nominal shocks. I mean, the CPI is just an average of what happens to everyone at all prices in the economy, okay? And sometimes it's food and sometimes it's energy, whatever. For a firm, you have real shocks, okay? So, you know, you may have the CPI going up, but, you know, you can increase your revenues very easily. Or your firm can't increase, but maybe it's energy, maybe it's food, maybe it's something that's causing the real shocks. And actually you have these shocks without having inflation. It's how you deal with the shocks to your firm, which are the real shocks you're focusing on. But the lead in between nominal and real, I don't see the relevance of that, okay? It's just how you deal with shocks. Hey, my energy costs have gone up, or my wages have gone up, okay? Because they're unionized, not because of whatever, not because of inflation. So the lead in, I don't quite understand. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know. I mean, totally agree with you, Stephen, right? So I think that is kind of like the way we think about it also intuitively, that firms just cannot really tell what they're hit with, right? So like these shocks, like, for example, when you think about energy prices, right? Like, is it because of inflation or is it because of, you know, I mean, as we see it right now, right? Is it because of a war, right? Like a real shock here, right? So, and that is kind of the source of it, right? So when we have let's say, these inflation pressures that we've seen before, where it's really just a price thing, or where we have then these real things that will really affect what the firm is doing, typically we just cannot disentangle between those. And if it's just a price thing and everything will adjust perfectly in the end, then probably this is not necessarily the best thing to react to that, but we really care about these real shocks. So basically the idea is that when you have these internal information systems, they just might help you reacting more to the parts of the signal that will actually then help you to generate value for your shareholders. That is the idea.
So Gary?
Yeah, Oliver, you started saying the recent coverage of inflation gives you some nice motivation, and I agree with that. But I also wonder if it raises a question, or whether you've focused a lot on internal information systems, but is there a role for third-party intermediaries who interpret macroeconomic data? You know, like you said, we've got a lot of pundits and press coverage saying this is indeed inflation. I'm wondering if your model or if your hypotheses account for external information processing like that.
Yes. So we now actually have a model in the. Unfortunately, we were not able to provide the latest version of the paper to the workshop yet because we are still actively working on it. But we have given demand, so speaking, we now have like a model in the bag. And you're absolutely right that we really focus on the internal information systems. But you're also absolutely right with that external information providers could also play a role here, right? For example, analysts and others. And this is definitely also something, you know, we could kind of think more about looking at. For example, when you think about the Hugon et al. Paper in 2014, when you have macroeconomic forecasters, they might actually then kind of work through a different mechanism here, right? So they might work through the other side of the picture. So I kind of highlighted that internal information systems are doing pretty well in disentangling and helping us to understand firm level shocks better. But if you have these information intermediaries, as you're talking about, for example, the macro analysts, they might help us to understand the left side of the picture better, right? The normal aggregate shocks, which actually has in the model that we wrote up in the paper has a pretty interesting implication. So when you look at the model, basically you get the result that if you increase the precision of the firm level shock, so I mean basically if internal information systems help us to understand firm level developments better, well then firms in general will react less to the inflation shock, right? So this is kind of our core hypothesis that we are putting out. In contrast, if you increase the precision of the aggregate nominal shock, so if you have like good macroeconomic forecasters that help you to understand that better, then that should actually increase, so speaking, the relation between investment and inflation, if that's better. I think the intuition there is fairly straightforward. If there's just less noise because you reduce that measurement error in the aggregate signal, and then you still have like a movement there, then that will have a larger effect, so speaking. So this is a very interesting channel that you outlined there, and also definitely something that would be very interesting to test. I totally agree.
So Sanjay?
Hi. Just following up on the previous comment on the difference between nominal and real shocks. I wonder if this is really an error or if there is something of a lag here. So if you have a shock, let's say to demand, your demand shock will be price times quantity. So obviously, you know that the quantity just does not change regardless of the price. So there is no information friction, I think. I would argue that an inflation shock would only lead to destruction of demand if the demand for product changed in general. So a real shock is more likely to happen now, whereas a nominal shock may or may not lead to demand or supply shocks later. So I wonder if that would explain this mechanism better than saying that there is an error in the signal, because I just don't see the error, to be quite honest.
No, there's no error. We're not talking about errors here. We're just talking
noise. Sorry,
about,
noise. Sorry,
yeah.
Sorry. I mean noise. Yeah.
Yeah, we're like think about, for example, I mean, think about inflation statistics that we see right now. Like we have CPI, we have PPI, we have GDP deflator. Well, first of all, what is the right one, right? So, I mean, there are tons of different signals there. And then at the same time, how do we construct these signals, right? So, I mean, how do we even measure prices? Well, that's very dependent on the basket of goods you're looking at, right? So even if we could agree on one of like the different, let's say, price development measures, well, it's not even clear that this is a good measure, right? Because the price of the baskets and like the composition of these baskets is different for everyone, right? Like, for example, you probably consume a little bit differently than I do. Some firms probably use different inputs than other firms, right? So that's kind of like there are many sources of I wouldn't call it error, but like potential noise, because you just cannot observe it, right? So it's impossible. It's impossible.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. All right. Sorry, is there?
Young also has his hand up.
Please.
Hi, Oliver. I'm curious, are there any papers talking about the relationship between or the impact of internal information system and the investment efficiency? In other words, it's just the impact of the of kind of like the moderating variable in your paper, and I'm talking about, is there any papers talking about the main effect of this moderating variable on the investment efficiency? So
yes.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking this is when I read the introduction, I'm thinking, hey, if we have a research conclusion from prior paper saying that better information system will lead to better decision making, including investment decisions, then almost as an implication, I can imagine that, hey, when there is a permanent shock, and then the impact would be on the investment would be bigger. And if there is a temporary shock or nominal shock or shock with a lot of noises, then the impact would be mitigated. So, so that's why I'm thinking like the main effect of this investment internal information system on the investment efficiency.
Yeah. So first of all, you're absolutely right. There's a paper about that. And that's, I think, Goodman et al. 2014. So basically what they do, if I remember correctly, is they look at the effect of, they basically correlate the precision of management, so the accuracy of management forecasts with stock returns around earnings announcements. And their conclusion is basically that we can use external management forecasts, so forecasts that they provide to external capital providers, to say that, look, this is actually a good measure of how the firm is making forecasts internally. And as a result, we can, if we are willing to make that step, then we can say, look, these internal information systems as proxied by the external forecast error, that actually leads to more efficient investment decisions. So that's kind of what's out there right now. I think point well taken. So I think what this paper does pretty well is it argues basically about the right-hand side of this picture, right? So if you have certain real developments, then okay, like if you have better information systems, yeah, then it seems to indicate that we make better real decisions. Okay. But if we think about the effects of inflation, so speaking, on investment, I'm not sure whether this could tell us so much. I think it would generally be able to tell us something about like the effects of those real shocks, but it's very unclear to me how it would kind of mitigate effects of inflation of investment, right?
I completely buy your motivation. I think inflation itself is very important, and I'm totally fine with that. So what I'm saying is, like perhaps for my own understanding, if we replace the inflation shock with some like generic temporary shock, and then would you still expect first your H1, like the impact, the relation between this temporary shock and the investing, and the H2, the moderating effect of the internal information system? Do you think that will still go through?
Mm. I mean, not in the, so actually not in the model as we have written it out right now.
Right.
So there it's important that this is about prices, right? So I mean, prices are basically just like a weighting of the relative importance of goods in the economy, right? So this is really where the friction comes here, that it's that prices are being, let's say that there are frictions in price adjustments. That's how kind of these these frictions that these models are built on come from. So if it's just a temporary shock in general and it doesn't have any impact on prices, then I think I wouldn't see how it would flow through. Just in terms of the Lucas type models.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Yeah, just to follow up on that comment, I guess my previous comment, do you need that left-hand side, the nominal aggregate shocks? Let's say I'm an airline and the price of airline fuel goes up, okay, because the Russians invaded Ukraine, whatever, okay? Is that any different? And there's no inflation. Is that any different from the price of energy goes up? And I'm not interested in actually the price of food, okay? So where does the inflation come in? I mean, I don't quite see the setup here. If you're reacting to price shocks, okay, the price shocks are with respect to what you use. I live in New York. I don't have a car. I don't care about the price of gasoline, okay? Someone out in the suburb cares very much about it. I care a bit about the price of food, okay? So I don't quite see your starting point of these nominal shocks, okay? What firm does is reacts to the prices of their input and the ability to pass that on in terms of revenues. So again, I just don't quite see the left-hand side here as the motivating.
Yeah, I think, you know, where this is kind of a pretty old question in macroeconomics. Basically, it comes to where, of course, like the bigger motivation comes from is whether we can aid the economy in manipulating the money supply, for example, right? So whether we can actually do anything good by, for example, engaging in loose monetary policy during bad times and engaging in very stringent monetary policy in good times. So basically, the idea is there that when times are bad, then the Federal Reserve can print a lot of money, and by doing so basically you just have like a money supply shock, so speaking. By doing so, you can actually ease out real frictions, right? So this is kind of the idea. And if you can, well, then things like monetary, if you have something like that, then things like monetary policy can actually help us to make better policy decisions that then improve the welfare of people, because you will be able to smooth out business cycles better. But if you cannot, well, then we are kind of in a bit in the world that you described. If it doesn't matter, then we shouldn't have, for example, monetary policy, right? If it's if money, if prices, if these relative prices adjust perfectly or don't matter, then we are really in the real world, and we shouldn't engage in that, right? So I think kind of where traditionally the motivation for this kind of research and this kind of thinking came from was basically questioning the existence of the Federal Reserve System, in particular the conduct of open market operations, so buying back bonds and increasing the money supply in a contra-cyclical fashion, whether that is useful in the first place, right?
So Young.
Hi, Oliver. I think I'm going to ask this question kind of related to what Steve's earliest point. I think Steve's main concern is that, of course, for Federal Reserve, inflation is actually a very, very important topic also for macroeconomics researchers. But for individual companies, really depending on whether their business actually related to those prices, kind of like including the CPI. So one thing I think you can do is, I don't know whether the World Management Survey you have, the first question you have for documentation is the survey asks the respondents what kind of the problems you actually often see in your businesses and do you document those problems, right? If you can see their answer, how often they talk about inflation as the problem they try to solve, and then try to link those inflation facing firms to their industries or geographic regions or different time periods to actually tell us a little bit more about what type of firms doing what in what situation were actually really concerned about inflation. I think that's kind of like a way to address Steve's point. It's not like all the firms have a sensitivity to inflation is 1 or above 1. There are definitely some zero beta firms that don't really care about inflation, but giving us a little bit color on what type of firms who really cared about inflation really help us to understand the underlying mechanism, what kind of firms driving your average results in tables. Yeah, I don't know whether you have data on whether that survey really give you that level of the details in the from their responses. Yeah.
It's an interesting point. So I mean, unfortunately, they don't provide that data. It's all anonymized, so we only really get the scores in the end. But I mean, like I think a broader point is we don't even need to care them about that, right? So they don't have to do that consciously. It's maybe something that they do, even though they don't think about it, right? That they sometimes make investment decisions in response to signals that they maybe wouldn't necessarily want to, right? And this is something that we'll get into in a little bit when I get to the investment efficiency results, right? So if it doesn't matter, well, then in the end, like investment efficiency shouldn't play a big role here. And so it kind of becomes a question of whether firms would actually want to react to that or not, right? So or whether they do it consciously or just implicitly. But I agree with you also generally that kind of getting a sense of whether firms actually think about that and to kind of highlight on whether this is, you know, as we forward here, whether this is just an implicit decision or whether this is a conscious decision, it would be kind of very interesting to see variation in that, right? So for example, Bill, let's think about the paper Gil presented the other week, right? So where he shows that firms are just presenting more and more and more macro information in the financial reports, indicating that this is maybe something, not inflation specifically, but macro more generally, that kind of starts to play a bigger role, where we actually might see more and more and more that firms are specifically thinking about these things and explicitly targeting addressing these issues. I think that also gets to Gary's point that he brought up earlier, that firms might then actively invest into alternative information sources, such as macroeconomists or financial analysts, that also help them to basically understand this left-hand side here of the equation that I show you here, so the nominal aggregate shock into the internal information systems better. And interestingly, then how that interacts, right? Because sometimes you might then have these initially counterintuitive effects that if you invest more in learning about these nominal aggregate shocks, that you kind of get even more sensitive towards things that you try to avoid in the first place. So it's very much agreed that kind of thinking about firms' endogenous decision to directly address the issue that we are kind of examining from a viewpoint a little bit, that that might not necessarily be their first order concern, might actually alternate this whole mechanism here quite a bit. So totally agree that this is something that would be quite interesting for us to look into. Thank you.
So next we have Sanjay and Seal.
Yeah, thank you. So I think if I follow the discussion, it seems to me that the concern that we all have is the baseline assumption here that an aggregate shock will automatically lead to a firm level shock. And it seems that the more that happens, the more the manager has to change his investment. So I would argue that the first thing we have to think about is does this aggregate shock lead to a firm level shock? And perhaps an information system can help with that. Right. And so just follow up on what we did, I think in the previous session. If you think about earnings beta, you would assume that a firm with a higher earnings beta is reacting more to aggregate shocks. You would also assume that happens because the manager was able to deal better with this aggregate shock, perhaps through his superior forecasting skills. But if that is the case, that I would think that we were not interested in the first moment, but in the second moment, right? So the precision of that decision. And so I would, for instance, expect that maybe the firm level stock price volatility will be lower for those who have a better internal information system, because we all have to deal with this aggregate shock. Some just are better to translate that shock to a firm level shock. Right? And but then we need to have another line connecting the aggregate shock to the firm level shock. But I think that is an implicit assumption right now. But I think we're questioning that. Is that really happening? Maybe I don't know if it makes sense.
So this is not an assumption made here. So the nominal shock does not lead to a firm level shock in this kind of thinking. They're actually, I mean, they are not independent, but they are separate shocks, right? And the whole mechanism here is that the firm then cannot, it just observes, so speaking, the joint thing. It does not say, look, okay, here we have the, let's say, the money supply doubling, for example, like a picture that I had in previous versions when I presented this paper was the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve and how that evolved around the COVID crisis. So basically we had COVID hitting, right? So a very real shock. And then you see at the same time that the central banks tried to do something about it. What did they do? Basically, within a couple of months, they more than doubled the money supply in the economy, right? So there you have like two things happening. Like I wouldn't say that the nominal shock here, the Federal Reserve printing a lot of money, caused the COVID crisis. I think that probably had alternative sources. Where it came from, I don't know, but I wouldn't say that that was because the Federal Reserve was printing money, right? But the key then is that firms kind of only see basically mixtures of these shocks, right? And the idea that we are forwarding, the mechanism, is that these internal information systems might help firms to make decisions that are value enhancing, or at least sensical in the short or even long run, right? So this is kind of the idea, but not that nominal shocks drive real shocks. That is not what we tried to do here. Sorry if I'm not clear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Sanjay.
Right, Seal?
Thank you. So as you mentioned about the central banks, I was wondering, like, how do you kind of distinguish the effect of the inflation shock and whatever kind of future central bank reactions to that? Because you have, like, I guess that's the worry now with firms. There's inflation coming, and there's also the worry that there's going to be high interest rate hikes. How do you distinguish these two kind of effects on the firm's investment decisions?
Yes. So in the model, it's just it's basically, that's the nice thing about writing models. I can just assume it. But in the question then, of course, is how do we operationalize that, right? And basically what we'll do later, which I actually come to right now. So let me show you. So here's the design. As you can see, we have inflation shocks, and that goes to the heart of your question as kind of a core variable of interest here. So how do we measure that? Well, basically, we try to look at realized inflation minus the forecasted inflation. So basically, we look at the difference from expectations. So basically, the idea behind this is that people in the economy, or in general, they see and they kind of expect what will happen, right? So for example, in terms of COVID and potential implications of that. And then they also, of course, anticipate what the central bank will do to fight that, right? And so we look at the deviation from that expectation, from that information that is available to people. So basically, the deviation from the inflation that they expect, right? So that is kind of our measure here, how we try to get at your comments here.
Right. I was just sort of worried that this inflation shock, I guess, this is also information for the central bank. Mm-hmm. And if there's a high inflation shock, they're going to address it with, I guess, more aggressive interest rate hikes. And that's also going to affect the firm's investment decisions, I think.
Yes, yes, for sure. So again, I guess then we are kind of like in a situation where we have to kind of figure out who knows the information first, so speaking. Basically, the implicit assumption here is we had a kind of a horizon of a year that the central bank does not necessarily have an information advantage over the average inflation forecaster here that makes that forecast, right? Whether that is a good assumption or not, of course, that is a good question, right? So, and I don't have a good answer for that. But if you have any suggestions for alternative inflation shock measure that might help us to get closer to it, that would be very much appreciated, of course.
Mani?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. So, Ollie, I'm looking at this model, and this may be related to some of the questions that were asked earlier. Everything on the right-hand side of the equation seems to be second moment or precision related stuff. Okay? You're sitting with some kind of muddled information thing, and then the shock itself is in some way, it's just a bunch of noisy things that are coming in and you're trying to process them. And you're saying that the internal information system is going to play a role in improving the precision of what you have to make your decision. Why would you want the left-hand side to be the level of investment? Wouldn't you want some kind of suboptimal, optimal investment, or not a model to describe that at a firm level and have that as your left-hand side as opposed to the level of investment?
Yep, good point.
Because it's almost like the right-hand side, second moment effects are all trying to cause a first moment effect on the left-hand side. And this may be also related to why Jung was confused about the sign of H1 itself, because it's very, very difficult to justify a second moment effect on first moment unless there is some kind of a story underlying this whole thing, which says that this is the direction in which investment would move. Yes.
So I guess like the way we thought about it when we came up with this specification was, we basically observe like shocks, and then as a result of that, people change their investments. An alternative way would be to kind of think about how they kind of have their change in investment. So if we had the change in investment as the dependent variable here, and I haven't thought about that.
And if you do that, then you can look at the inflation shock as something that messes or muddles up everything from an information standpoint, and your information system as something that works in the opposite direction and makes things work. So it will become much easy from an interpretation standpoint.
Yes. Yeah, definitely something to think about. I mean, I kind of like the way we kind of thought about, I guess, addressing like the broader comment that you're making is like, first, the intention here is to just document, okay, there are relations here, right? So we basically document, and we are not the first ones to document, that it seems like that these nominal variables indeed have real effects, right? So that we even see an effect of inflation on investment. And the second one, then, okay, like how is that mitigated by information? And then showing, of course, in the next set of tests that I'll show you after this one, what implications does it have for investment efficiency, right? So first, basically documenting, okay, there's a relation between investment and inflation. It's mitigated by information systems, but is that optimal in any sense? And then later, I will show you that, yes, indeed, it seems like that these information systems help firms to make better investment decisions, so more optimal investment decisions. That's kind of like the flow we were thinking about. But then to look at the change in the investment policy, that was something that we haven't considered yet and need to think about. Thank you, Mani.
Great. No one has their hand up, so I think you can move on.
All right. Thanks for all the questions. All right, so here's basically how we put it together. So we have inflation shocks. How do we measure them? And we already talked about this, right? So we look at, which is probably pretty intuitive, and also basically when you look at these macro models, actually the way these things are specified in these models, we look at deviations from expectations, right? So this is our inflation shock here. We also include control variables that are suggested in prior literature when one tackles questions like that. as suggested in Bloom et al. 2018. And that is the first and the second aggregate moment, so growth expectations and macroeconomic uncertainty. And here is basically the inflation shocks we look at. And here you have a histogram of those that we have. And it's probably pretty intuitive, right? So if we have a decent shock measure, we would think that these shocks would cluster around zero. Otherwise, they would become kind of predictable at some point, right? So the shock character would be a bit lost. However, we have some outliers. So we have, for example, Chile in 2009. So that was in the beginning of the financial crisis that started in 2007, right? So there things actually got quite a bit worse than expected. So we had actually massive deflation around that time in Chile. And then on the other extreme, we have China in 2010 as the economy rebounded much quicker than anyone would have anticipated. China started growing, it started growing very strongly, early on after the financial crisis. So here we have kind of these outliers. And then, of course, the crux is how to measure the firm variables here. Let me first talk briefly about the controls. So we use the Bureau van Dijk's database, Amadeus, and we control for other management practices that Jung already mentioned early on in this presentation. We control for external reporting quality and investment determinants that have been highlighted by prior literature, in particular cash flow, changes in cash flow, changes in sales, which is according to Budget et al. 2013, a good measure for Tobin's Q for private firms. And as we have private firms in our sample, we cannot really compute market to book ratios here. And we have leverage and size. And here's, of course, the meat of it all, right? So this is the WMS survey, the World Management Survey. And this is what we use to determine firm strength of the information systems. So what is the World Management Survey? Well, it's the first cross-country, cross-industry survey data set that was built to measure the quality of management practices in establishments worldwide. So what do? Well, they cover a sample of randomly sampled public and private firms for the period 2002 to 2015 at this point. The survey is still ongoing, so we hope that we'll get some even more recent data soon. Has been extensively verified by previous research in management. And it's based on double-blind interviews, phone interviews, 45 minutes long, of professional interviewers hired by the World Management Survey with senior managers at the firm. So what do? Well, what does double-blind mean here? The interviewer does not know about the financial performance of the firm. They don't even know the name of the firm. They just know that they will have a call with this person. And the manager does not know that they're being scored by the interviewer. So it's an open-ended interview. The interviewer asks indirect questions and scores the firm based on a scoring grid that was designed by an independent consulting firm by the World Management Survey when the survey got started for the first time. And we particularly single in on the monitoring survey questions of the World Management Survey to measure firms' internal information quality. And I'll show you the individual questions a bit later in this presentation. So here's the sample composition. It's not surprising that given the authors of the World Management Survey, we have certain clusters here in the United Kingdom, in Greece, and in Italy. So there we have definitely concentrations in our sample. And here we have our main results from the equation that I showed you guys earlier, right? So investment as a dependent variable and inflation in the interaction with internal information systems as the two variables of interest. So we see indeed, as prior research has already documented, that inflation seems to have an effect on investment. And interestingly, and this is kind of the hypothesis that we are building on, our core hypothesis here is that internal information systems indeed play a role. They mitigate that relation, right? So around, when you look at it here, like a third of the relation. So this is, I think these are all standardized at this point. I think they're standardized. So around a third of the overall relation is can be taken away by internal information systems.
Young has a question.
Young, please.
Ollie, this is the perfect timing because my question relates to this table. So is it possible for you to run some placebo test for that inflation surprise coefficient become insignificant? I think a lot of the discussion so far is that inflation potentially will become mingled with some of the real underlying activities. For example, right now when we see the inflation goes up because we don't have semiconductor chips, we don't have cars to buy, right? There are some real activities actually going on behind Federal Reserve's decision to print more money. But can you go through all those inflation shocks and identify some situations when that is purely due to bureaucratics, political issues that has nothing to do with the underlying demand and supply? And are you able to find, or any other prior study are able to find, for those situations, potentially the coefficient of inflation surprise is weaker or even become insignificant? Just that it would give us a little comfort about what exactly inflation captures and what are the other confounding factors potentially explain your result. And the other kind of related thing is that if this is indeed a shock, you can just change the investment to a future period, and you should also find insignificant results, right? Investment should not respond to future, investment will be T-1. Inflation surprise will be T. So investment today should not respond to the inflation shock that we have not observed yet. That would be another kind of like validation of placebo test you can run to actually validate whether this indeed a surprise. That's kind of like the second suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ayum. Yeah, I mean, the second test, very doable, right? So just basically regress investment on future inflation shocks. So to kind of get a sense of whether those are actually like shocky, right? So very much agreed. With respect to the first one, so you're basically, I think your suggestion is that we should identify shocks where it's obvious to people that this is a pure inflation shock without any real component, and then we shouldn't see anything. Yes, I agree. That would be very interesting to do. So we'll think about that and try to find such shocks. I mean, on the top of my head, I cannot think of one right now, but I mean, I very much agree that when you have a situation where it's clear to everyone that this is a pure act, like a pure price shock that basically doesn't change relative prices whatsoever, but just elevates everything. What does that
presidential elections, some of the political events, like every 4 years, most of the countries need to change their leader, and changes in the Congress potentially will have that predictable changes in monetary policy. That just
I mean, hopefully the Federal Reserve is independent from that, but yeah, so yeah, maybe like that. We've seen that right over the past couple of years where it was pretty clear that the president was exerting pretty direct influence on the central bank. So yeah, maybe there's something there. Yeah, something to think about. Presidential elections. Yeah, it's quite interesting. We'll look into it, Ayung. Thank you.
So Allison and Steve also have questions, and I think I'll probably stop the questions there because you only have a few minutes. You only have 7 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Holly.
I'll talk really fast, Holly. I promise.
Awesome.
It's a really interesting paper, Oliver. Thanks for writing it. I actually had a question about how you think about this data set that you're using, the WMS data, because essentially it's really just, it's a really rich data set, so that's a plus, but also it's really just capturing like a firm at like one point in time. There isn't time series for the vast majority of these observations. And so you'd really like to see how changes in internal information affect changes in investment. You can maybe do that with like 25%, I think, of the observations, but I'm guessing you'll probably only have it at max 2, maybe 3 firm year observations from the same firm. So I was wondering how you thought about that in the context of what you're examining, because really internal information could capture kind of anything about that firm. And because we only observe a single firm year for most of the observations, it gets a little challenging.
Yes. Very much agreed. And you're pointing out probably one of the biggest weaknesses of this data set, and this is that because they are always resampling, right? So they're always kind of going in and randomly resampling firms. As a result of that, we really have And that's also the reason why you see industry fixed effects in this table rather than firm fixed effects, right? So we cannot really say anything about changes in the internal information system at the firm level, exactly for that reason, right? Because we don't observe changes. Most of the time, we literally just observe like one variation in time, and very much agree that this is limiting here what we can do. But fortunately, we'll have an analysis that I'll show you in a little bit where we use a novel setting, and that was basically SOX for the European Union, the EU directive, where we see a change, hopefully an exogenous change in firms' internal information systems that then have an effect. Give me a couple of slides, then hopefully I can show you something interesting there. Thanks, Alison.
So Steve says he'll pass his question and give you the last 5 minutes.
Okay. Please send me an email, Steve. Would very much like to hear your question. So, but let's keep going. All right. So here's the main result, right? So investment on inflation surprises and the interaction, and we find this mitigating effect here. And then, of course, like something we've been talking about earlier, is this investment efficiency component, right? So is this reaction that we observe here, is that really efficient in some sense? And we follow prior literature here to look at what happens in the future, right? And we look at two outcome variables. The first one is future profitability, which is most prevalently used. And there we see that future profitability decreases actually in these inflation surprises. And again, we see that this negative effect on future profitability is then mitigated by internal information quality, right? So we interpret this as evidence that indeed internal information helps us here to make better decisions. We do the same thing for future productivity, which is measured as sales scaled by the number of employees, right? So it's a turnover ratio. And we see here that this efficiency also decreases, albeit the effect is not statistically significant here. But again, we see that the negative effect is mitigated by the quality of firms' internal information systems. And this now gets to Alison's point, right? So we would be interesting to kind of look at changes in internal information systems. And of course, ideally so, something that is at least exogenous to the firm, right? So other reasons for that would be firms are more exposed to macro, they might invest more into macro, into learning more about macroeconomics. And that's the Hugon et al. Paper that Gary brought up earlier today. So we need to find some exogenous variation in inflation system quality. And for that, we look at a setting that, to our knowledge, hasn't been used very much yet, even though it's quite an interesting setting. And that is the 8th EU company directive. So basically, what was this about? Well, it was introduced in the European Union, in different countries at different times, to reinforce and to harmonize the statutory audit function. But actually, it also really had direct effects on firms' internal information systems. It required firms to adopt more adequate and effective controls, and also really and also provide adequate reporting on their internal information systems, right? So firms were forced to improve them, and firms were now forced to report about them, so that you also had some external pressure, so speaking, on firms to do that better. So interestingly, it applies to public firms, but not to private firms, but we have both types of firms in our sample. And it's adopted at different times by different countries. Of course, that comes with its own issues. As we all learned recently, staggered difference and difference has its issues, but we use novel solutions that are provided in the econometrics literature to address those. So the solutions that I show you here, they are all incorporating, the results I show you here, they're all incorporating the solutions. So here we have post times public and our first stage model. Do we actually see, again, getting to Alison's points, do we see that internal information systems improve? And according to our findings, that's indeed what we see. So the quality of internal information systems as measured by the monitoring score increases. And then later, when we look at the relation between this effect here of inflation, of this increase in internal information quality on the investment inflation relation, we again see that it decreases, right? So this gives us some comfort that our findings might hold more generally. So then we have parallel trends hold. So our identifying assumption there seems satisfied. We also look at some cross-sectional cuts. In particular, we look at when we have difficulty in micro level and macro level prediction, where our channel here might be particularly important. And we generally find that in more volatile environments, this mitigating role of information quality seems to be quite important at the micro and the macro level. We also look at alternative explanations. For example, we already control for external information quality in our controls, but we also look at it here in different sets, and we don't find that external information quality seems to play a big role here. We also look at competition, and there we actually see, in contrast to predictions of other models, other frictions, in particular new Keynesian models, we see that our results are actually concentrating in the part of the section where those models would predict it wouldn't in the high competitive environments. We also look at the different components of information systems, and here they're all spelled out, the different ones that we see for the World Management Survey, and we see it's pretty general with the exception of information review. I don't have time to get into these different questions, but happy to chat about it thereafter if you want to learn more about that. We also have a couple of robustness tests here that I won't get into. So let me conclude. We have some current developments. Inflation is at a 40-year high right now. And we have some predictions here from different models. So in contrast to real business cycle models, money matters in imperfect information models. And internal information quality serves as a transition mechanism for aggregate nominal shocks. We examine these predictions in an international sample of firms. And as predicted by these imperfect information models, we document a positive relation between inflation shocks and real investment decisions that is mitigated by internal information system quality, and filtering of information shocks apparently leads to higher investment efficiency. The next ADP presentation will be on March 4th with a very interesting paper by Eric Weisbrod from Kansas. So his paper will be about forecasting earnings using K-nearest neighbors. So a fun valuation paper that I very much enjoy. So looking forward to that. Until then, I want to thank you all for being here, for taking the time, and for all the great comments and suggestions. We very much appreciate it. It will make the paper much better. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you soon again.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone.